This program is brought to you by Fresh FM.
Welcome to Before the Flood. I'm your host, Patrick Rose, and we're broadcasting on Fresh FM, broadcasting across the top of the South Island and around the world at freshfm.net. We've got a very important show for you today. This is a show that affects all of us, affects all of our children and our children's children. This is about plastic in the ocean. We have talked about it before, and we've heard about the stories and the rumors, and some of us might have even seen some of the photos of these massive plastic patches, the most famous of which is the Great Pacific Plastic Patch, which is off the coast of California and off the coast of Hawaii, and it really spreads all the way almost to Japan now. It's very debatable about how big it is, how much plastic's out there, and so on, but basically the currents of the world are pushing all of the debris, all of the plastic in the world into various locations. In fact, there are 5 of them. The Pacific one is obviously the most talked about, the most well known. It's roughly the size of Texas. That is the most conservative estimate. Some people say it's actually the size of Canada. And we have some very, very special guests here to talk with us about this disastrous problem, because it's not just that the plastic is kind of all gotten together and we can scoop it out. It's actually breaking down into tiny little microparticles, and the particles look exactly like zooplankton or fish eggs. And so, of course, what's happening is the fish and all the other bacteria and all the other organisms, the whales and the dolphins, they're all eating this stuff, and it's getting into their blood, it's getting into our food chain, but is also poisoning hundreds of thousands of animals every year, and it's poisoning human beings, and there's no way to clean it up, as far as the experts are concerned. And part of the problem is that this is in international waters, and so it's a very, very gray area as who's responsible, whose plastic is this. No one really wants to take ownership for it, let alone foot the bill for cleaning this up. So some of the guests we have here today by telephone, we have Captain Charles Moore from California. He is, by any stretch of the imagination, one of the leading experts in this subject. He actually discovered the patch, if you will, in 1997 on one of his trips back from Hawaii into California. He kept on noticing more and more rubbish all around, and he started doing tests. And he runs something called the Agalita Foundation in Southern California, which is really devoted to raising awareness about this, and he's become one of the global sort of experts in this. We also have Leslie Tamnin, and she's an advisor to the government of California. She's been an advisor to Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, the former governor, and she is really looking principally at how do you stop this plastic getting into the whole system. And so we'll talk with her about education and legislation and regulation. And then finally, a very special guest. This is Fabien Cousteau joining us from New York City. He is he's the grandson of Jacques Cousteau, the great oceanographer and explorer, and the man who brought us scuba diving and all these other sort of wonderful things. He's speaking with us about his direct experience about being out in the most remote parts of the ocean, and talking about how suddenly you can see a Coca-Cola bottle floating by, and he'll talk to us about the actual impact that it has on the marine life. So it's a very, very sort of daunting show in a lot of ways, because the problem is so big, and as we look at some of the issues, there's no clear answers. But I mean, I think that one of the things that comes across is definitely something that my listeners will be familiar with, which is ultimately this is a market-driven problem. This is a problem that's driven largely by the greed of the corporations, because they are getting this plastic basically for free. The ethanol and the byproducts of petrol production is what goes into making plastics, and that is basically cheaper than dirt, as they say, and so that's why it's being pumped into the plastic, and it's being pumped into all the consumer products that we're buying. And then, of course, very, very, very few of that is actually being recycled, and so it's ending up not just in landfill, but thrown off of our cars and washed out to sea. And I think everyone has the experience of walking down the beach and being disgusted or sort of very, very upset, at least disturbed by all the plastic that washes up onto the beaches. But this is actually only getting worse, and it's like I think one of my guests talks about the problem of it's the boiling frog thing, and the frog that's in the boiling water doesn't really notice it. And maybe, if we were to notice that 20 years ago, the amount of plastic that we have now would be absolutely shocking. But because it's been incremental, we're kind of saying, oh, there's just a lighter, it's a plastic bag, it's a bit of McDonald's, it's a Coca-Cola thing. It's not so shocking to us. But actually, when some of the statistics, and I'll just read some of the numbers here for you. This is from a site called plasticoceans.net. There are 300 million tons of plastic being used every year, and half of that is just used once and thrown away. There are 500 billion plastic bags that are used worldwide. More than 1 million bags are used every minute. A plastic bag has an average working life of 15 minutes. And in the U.S. alone, 60 million plastic bottles are thrown away every day. And so you can see this is a huge problem. And just as it relates to the ocean, there's 4.7 million tons of plastic spills into our ocean every year, an average of 120,000 tons each day. And so, yeah, it's a big problem. I'd say one of the things that we're going to look at today is how do you start to reduce the amount of plastic that's going into our system, and what we're starting to see in our discussion with Leslie Tamminen in different districts across North America and even districts across the developed world and Europe. There actually are very, very strict controls going in on plastic and different kinds of plastic, what's being used. Instead of just saying, oh, let's build more recycling plants, they're actually saying, let's stop selling so much plastic. And the way that they're having success is actually having local districts organize and say, you know what, we're banning plastic bags in Tasman District Council, or, we're banning plastic bottles in Nelson. And so the manufacturers have to respond, because they say, oh gosh, well, we want to be part of selling Coca-Cola in, so let's say, San Francisco. So we're going to have to build a separate bottle. And once they start to build those separate bottles that aren't made of plastic, then ultimately we're going to start to see them rolling that out, because it just makes good sense across the entire different regions. So this is really a really powerful local issue, and I think that's one that New Zealand, particularly our region here in the top of the south, could take a very, very strong stance on and really become a world leader in. And I think that I'm hoping that someone who's associated with our environment minister, Dr. Nick Smith, is listening, starts to really put pieces together here and say, gosh, well, we can actually do something. It's not insurmountable. We can actually start to legislate and reduce the amount of plastic that's going into our consumer system and ultimately into our oceans. Because, frankly, people, recycling is not working. It's a huge cost for our councils, and it's a huge cost for our governments, and it's a huge cost for our planet. And education is not working. We've been pushing this for 20 years, and it's had very, very limited uptake. And ultimately, it's a futile effort because it's requiring so much effort to do it. So, as I say, our first guest today is Captain Charles Moore. If you Google Pacific Plastic Patch, Captain Charles Moore is the first face you're going to see. As I say, he discovered it, effectively, if that's an illustrious, rather unillustrious title to have. He discovered the patch back in 1997 on a way back from Hawaii, and he has published numerous articles on the subject. His first paper, documented in 1999, it shocked the scientific world. It found that there were 6 times more plastic fragments by weight in the Central Pacific than the associated zooplankton. He's the author of a review article in 2008, the issue of Environmental Research, Synthetic Polymers in the Marine Environment, a rapidly increased long-term threat. He has been on ABC's Nightline, Good Morning America, National Public Radio, Rolling Stone, The Wall Street Journal, among other things. And so I asked Captain Charles Moore, well, what is it about the plastic why is it such a serious problem?
Just imagine if you were in a supermarket and 6 out of the 7 apples in the display were good plastic fakes. You'd get fooled, and indeed that's what's happening. Fish that prey at the surface on zooplankton, which are the animal plankton, the small animals that eat the plants that exist, what they call primary production out in the deep ocean. The sunlight creates photosynthesis in marine plants, and then these little animals eat them, and then fish eat the little zooplankton. And we found that the fish that are eating that zooplankton, 35% of them had plastic in their stomachs, and one of them, just a little one as big as your finger, had 83 pieces of plastic in its stomach. So it's not only, fish, because fish can see and they have a rudimentary ability to taste and reject things that they don't want, but the majority of feeding that goes on out there is by mucilaginous jellies and salps that stick to whatever's out there and process it as food, because that was a good strategy from an evolutionary standpoint. And now they're sticking to plastic, and plastic is becoming part of the food web. All these diagrams that purport to show what eats what out in the ocean, they call food web diagrams, need to be revised, because plastic is now being eaten by every level, every what they call trophic level, from the smallest zooplankton up to the great whales, are now consuming plastic waste as part of their regular diet.
How does this compare when you compare it to, the stuff that we're pumping into the rivers and into the oceans? Isn't the plastic a bit of a minor issue by comparison?
I don't think so. It exacerbates the former. You see, what you've got is a situation where the molecular structure of plastic is very open to any kind of oily pollutant like PCBs, DDE, your pesticides, your herbicides, your industrial chemicals. A lot of them are oily, and plastic polymers have space in their molecules for these oily pollutants. In other words, when there's an oil spill, the booms that are put out are made out of consumer plastics, the same kind of things that make your water bottles and your bottle caps. The polypropylene and polyethylene, they're kind of expanded and puffed out into a sponge, and that plastic sponge has the same effect on oil as a regular sponge has on water. It soaks it up. And because plastic is such a good sponge for pollutants, it's able to hang on to them and concentrate them up to 1 million times their level in the surrounding seawater, and transmit those pollutants then to whatever consumes them. So it's really creating untold numbers of poison pills for the marine food web.
And how much of this is actually getting into the consumer food chain? I mean, the industry seems to be saying, well, look, it seems to be a bit exaggerated. It's not quite as big as everyone's saying, and they're kind of trying to get people on the technicalities of how big it is, and there's a lot of sensationalism here. Is it really getting into the fish that we're eating and into our food systems?
I don't think there's any doubt about it. The mahi-mahi, which is a member of the jack family, similar to your yellowtail and jack mackerel. This family of fish, we caught them. They're a pelagic fish that's on the menu in most seafood restaurants, and we caught them with plastic in their stomachs. Now, it's been shown that the plastic in the kind of acidic bath that is the digestive juices of an organism releases those hydrophobic contaminants, those pesticides and herbicides and industrial chemicals that are absorbed into it. They, in the environment of an animal's stomach, those chemicals get released, and then they begin to be processed into the tissues of the animal. So a study was done on supermarket seafood in Singapore, and every single type of seafood had bisphenol A in it, which is one of the plasticizers used in polycarbonate plastics and in epoxies. And
you mentioned the effect on some of the marine life. What about some of the birds that then eat these fish, or some of the what sort of effects are we seeing from not just the fish but in the larger marine environment?
Well, birds are dying, whales are dying. Even the baleen whales, like our California gray whale, have washed up on beaches with stomachs full of jogging trousers and golf balls and plastic bags and surgical gloves. And these are whales that feed on the mud at the bottom of the ocean. They're getting the plastics that are heavier than water, and then the birds are getting the stuff that floats. Hundreds of thousands of Laysan albatross are dying with stomachs full of plastic that have been fed to them by their parent bird that's gone out scavenging over thousands of miles of ocean, picking up these bright-colored plastic bottle caps and lighters and bringing them back and regurgitating them into the chick at their rookery. And the chicks have a satiation reflex that kicks in when the stomach is full, so they stop begging for food, so they're dying with a full stomach, not to mention the fact that, they're being contaminated by the chemicals absorbed to these plastics.
Is this the legacy of sort of, the 60s and 70s when we weren't as careful environmentally and things ended up in the ocean? And now, since the 90s and the last 20 years, we've been a lot more careful. Sure, consumerism, there's more plastic products than ever before, but aren't they ending up more in landfill and less in the ocean? Is this kind of a sleeper problem that's hitting us now, or is this actually ongoing?
What you're characterizing is what we might call the developed world: Europe, Australia, New Zealand, United States, Japan. Those countries, while still releasing lots of plastic to the environment, have waste handling infrastructure. But plastic is now being embraced in the developing world where there is no infrastructure. The recycling is not keeping up with the proliferation of the product. It's what I call the lubricant of globalization. This effort to have the cheapest labor market for your manufacturing requires that you wrap the finished product in plastic so that it arrives at the market area in a pristine condition, because plastic is a moisture barrier and a vapor barrier, so it insulates the product from harmful corrosive and dirt getting into it during shipment, and that's why I call it the lubricant of globalization. It allows you to go to the cheap labor markets, to make your product, to package it then in plastic, but that plastic becomes worthless the minute you unwrap the product. So unless there's a well-developed infrastructure, which even in the developed world there's not, even your plastics 1 through 6, it's very rare that you find any place doing all 1 through 6, let alone the vast variety of plastics in number 7, which is anything that's not 1 through 6.
What sort of accountability is there? I mean, you mentioned that we're seeing a proliferation of these, the pellet manufacturers and the manufacturers within the developed world. Isn't there any movement to try to sort of get a more sustainable alternative to these pellet manufacturing processes that's pumping all this plastic into the developed world?
The market forces are such that because the world has embraced the automobile, tremendous amounts of petroleum have to be refined into gasoline. And the ethylene that makes your most common plastic, polyethylene, is a waste product in that process. So it's very cheap, and it would otherwise be burned. A lot of times if you drive by a petroleum refinery, you'll see a stack that looks like a giant candle with flame coming out of it. A lot of times that's ethylene because there's no market for these other gases that are part of the gasoline refining process. So ethylene being one of them that makes the most common consumer plastic, polyethylene, that price is going to be rock bottom compared to other materials. So yes, there are marine degradable plastics, there are compostable plastics, but they occupy less than 1% of the market, because they cost more.
You mentioned in the developing world the proliferation of these plastics in the Philippines and throughout Asia and different countries without these sort of environmental controls, without recycling centers, and they're buying Coca-Cola, they're buying some of these plastic water bottles or whatever they can get, and it's ending up in the creeks and into the rivers, into the bays, into the ocean. Are we going to see other plastic patches out in the Pacific or in the South China Sea or in the Indian Ocean very shortly?
As a matter of fact, it's a fait accompli. My colleague, Dr. Erickson, I mentioned earlier, started with his wife, Anna Cummins, the Five Gyres Institute, and they have been chartering vessels of opportunity to go to these other garbage patches and see if they are real. And they've now completed the entire Five Gyres, and all of them have the same kind of problem at their centers. somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 million plastic particles per square kilometer. It's the North and South Atlantic, each has one, North and South Pacific, and then the Indian Ocean. So that's why they call it the Five Gyres Institute. And yes, they are real. They are accumulating the waste of civilization, and since plastic is not biodegradable, they harbor it for an untold length of time.
And what sort of health effects might we start to see as you know, we start to consume the fish that are eating that have this in their bloodstream?
Cancer is something that is important, but the so-called canary in the mine shaft for humans is at the poles, and it's not so much cancer as it is a disruption of the hormone system, what they call endocrine disruption. And we see it in the natives of the Aleutian Islands, the Eskimos in Alaska, the Aleuts, the Greenlanders. The ratio of female children to male children is now 2 to 1, and that's due to endocrine disruption. And the mothers are being told not to breastfeed because their milk has so many of these hormone-disrupting chemicals in it. So I think what the plastic plague is telling us is that we are gradually feminizing the biosphere, including ourselves, and that's a dead end for any sexually reproducing species.
That was Captain Charles Moore joining us by telephone from California, Southern California, where he is the founder and the leader of the Agalita Marine Research Institute, and he is, as I say, one of the leading experts in the plastic patch. I think nobody has more experience in going through the patch and trying to sort of measure it and determine how bad it is. One of the things that he it says here on his biography that he has traveled 40,000 miles of the North Pacific Ocean across 22 degrees of latitude and 70 degrees of longitude. His latest 10,000-mile voyage took him and his crew 2/3 of the way to Japan across the international date line. Now, Captain Moore has been working on the problem of the plastic in the sea and measuring it and trying to get this information and this word out to us here in the consumer world. Someone else who is working on the other side of it, which is Leslie Tamminen. I mentioned her earlier. Just to give you an idea, she works for what's called Seventh Generation Advisors, and they are one of the leading experts in trying to assess this problem and look at all different alternatives and so on. So Leslie and I had a conversation. She was in Geneva when we spoke by telephone. And she's really looking at this from a totally different angle, not just looking at what plastics are out there and what the effect is. That's already a given. But she's looking at what we can actually do about it.
The plastics that are in our ocean.
I think the most important thing to do at this point is to regulate and legislate. Education is important and has a place, but as the last 20 years have shown in America, the focus has been on education and recycling and cleanup. And I think we need to shift our focus to actual source reduction. And because that is a big change in the status quo and special interests have something to lose, I think in order to accomplish source reduction, we're going to actually have to regulate and legislate.
Plastic is nothing new. We've been cranking it out into the ecosystems for the last 40, 50 years. How come nobody's done the math until now? And how come, if it's so sort of damaging, how come the governments and the agencies that are supposed to be protecting us have been asleep at the wheel?
Well, many countries have not been asleep at the wheel. Don't forget, almost a quarter of the world's population lives in a country that has banned or put a fee on plastic bags. China, parts of Africa, almost all of the EU, many countries, including recently Afghanistan, have things about plastic and single-use plastic packaging. It's only America where we have an interesting political system that allows corporate special interests to have an extreme amount of influence, where we have kept the focus on recycling rather than on source reduction. And I think that there have been many studies that have shown the deleterious effects of plastic, but America, like other countries, has been very slow, unlike other countries, has been very slow to respond to that. And I think that the reason is because of the extreme amount of political clout wielded by the deep pockets of the chemical industry, which, if you look at the membership companies of the American Chemistry Council, most of their member organizations are many of them are big oil. Chevron, Exxon, British Petroleum. I mean, these are the most powerful corporate interests in the world, and they are the reason that we have not progressed to more sustainable types of packaging.
How are we going to undo the system just by passing a few laws, maybe just in the San Francisco sort of metropolitan area or even California? Are we really going to be able to chip away at this iceberg?
I believe we can, and I think the reason we can is because more and more cities, for example, and local governments are finding it in their economic self-interest to accomplish source reduction. They realize that the cost of disposing of single-use plastic packaging is enormous. They realize that the harmful effects to their tourism industry because of excessive litter is harmful to them. And I think they have a financial incentive now to start regulating the amount of production of plastic at its source. And once you have that sort of local incentive, I think what you see is what's happening in California. We've been unable to push back the American Chemistry Council at the state level, but at the local level, every week, additional cities start running ordinances to ban single-use plastic bags, or to ban polystyrene, or to ban bisphenol A, a harmful endocrine disruptor found commonly in plastic. Once you get that groundswell, it's inevitable that state legislation will follow. And even though it has not happened yet in California, I believe it will. I believe it will happen in other states, even if that is ahead of California. And I think once you get states showing that you can have alternative, sustainable types of packaging which are safe for humans, for aquatic life, for wildlife, and for human health, then you are going to get national and even regional cooperation.
Well, let's say we do get some major victories in major metropolitan areas and saying, okay, we'll ban plastic bottles here, we'll ban plastic bags in San Francisco, or plastic bottles. How is the Coca-Cola company, for instance, going to turn around and say, oh, we've got to make special bottles just for San Francisco now? Do you think that people in San Francisco would be happy to go without a Coca-Cola?
Well, I actually think that it's local laws that make for an uneven playing field that really makes industry tear its hair out, and want some kind of level playing field in the form of a state law, for example. If you have a Vons on one side of a city dividing line that has banned single-use plastic bags, and another market a block away that has not, it makes for a terrible distribution nightmare and headache for business. So interestingly, when there's enough of a patchwork approach, business can sometimes become more friendly and amenable to a statewide solution. So I think that is something that we could see perhaps in the future.
What sort of solutions are there that use modern technology now that are still going to be cost effective for corporations to make this switch and do it in a way that's not going to totally hurt their bottom line too much?
Well, I know, for example, that here in California, when we looked at single-use plastic bag manufacturing, that much to our surprise, we found that at least in California, the vast majority of manufacturers were not making single-use plastic bags. They were distributing them. The bags came from China, and that was a shock because we realized that the majority of jobs in California dependent on single-use bags actually came from green, sustainable, reusable bag companies, such as Chico Bag. Andy Keller, the president, who is currently being sued by many cohorts of the American Chemistry Council, the plastic bag makers, for speaking out against plastic pollution. So I think that there are some situations where you might think industry would be harmed when actually it's the reusable, sustainable green jobs in a locality that actually will be benefited. And for where there are factories or products that are being made We found, for example, that with retooling credits or longer lengths of time to implement and phase out a certain product, that many jurisdictions have been willing to accept legislation, because often these factories make more than one type of plastic product, and often they are capable of retooling to meet the demands of regulation. So regulation does not have to be the scary the scary thing always that you might think of when you first hear it. And at least in California, we've seen that many businesses have found ways to comply. Another good example is we passed in California a law requiring best management practices for pre-production resin pellets. They're tiny little plastic beads that are sort of the basic flour of any plastic product, and they're called nurdles by surfers. And we passed a law to require best management practices so they don't get loose and into the street and into storm drains where they're impossible to be picked up because they're so small. They escape every other kind of mechanism. They mimic fish eggs in the ocean environment, and they can be extremely toxic. And that was something that industry actually worked with us to pass and has supported having best management practices requiring catchment of the little nurdles or sweeping or different other kinds of things at places of transport and handling. So I think there are many situations where industry can be an ally and not just an enemy, where they can retool or they can figure out a way to make a safer, better product, or recycle it, or be responsible for it in a different manner.
Without going down a path of trying to regulate absolutely sort of everything, let's say someone comes up with an alternative to the plastic bag, but it's made out of cornstarch, and then we say, oh gosh, we're diverting, corn from the food cycle and putting it into making plastic bags here. I mean, or someone says, okay, well, we'll use a paper-based product, and then, we're using all the nastiness that comes with logging and the soil erosion or something like that. So how do you sort of, we might solve the plastic bag problem, but then cause 4 other problems in the process? How do we get around that?
That is such an interesting point, and it's so true. And it's always that delicate balance when you're trying to regulate or legislate. Do you get out of the frying pan and get yourself into the fire by accident? And of course, those things are always unintended. And my best answer to you is that usually thoughtful policy or thoughtful legislation takes the most known contingencies it can into account at the time and tries the best it can to protect against creating other problems elsewhere. Where we are unable to do that, I think you have to simply accept that legislation is incremental. And there may be times where you may have to go back in ensuing years to change a threshold number or to alter a definition or to do things like that. I think, though, that with plastic, there are so many known aspects of it. I believe it is so dangerous for aquatic life and for human health that the benefit of giving our best shot at regulating it far outweighs any detriment, that we would cause by doing so. I think that if we do not act, we fail ourselves, and that, getting it exactly right, the perfect should not be the enemy of the good.
That was Leslie Tamminen joining us from Geneva, where she's traveling, and she is based in Northern California, in Sacramento, in fact, and they are a sort of advocacy, sort of legislative awareness group trying to raise awareness about not just the plastic patch, which is our main subject of discussion, but actually going back a step and trying to say, how do we stop this plastic from getting into our consumer system? As she discussed, we've had 20 plus years, almost 30 years of really active recycling programs. Now, these recycling programs have the cost of them has fallen to the local councils, and of course, this is local councils. There's very few councils in the world that are flush enough to really invest properly in this infrastructure, and ultimately, it's fallen down to the consumers. It's up to us to save our plastic and our cans, and then bring it in and recycle it. And so, not surprisingly, we have not seen a huge uptake in this. We have seen massive improvement, for sure, but we're still seeing over half of the things that we buy end up back into landfill. Now, this is a huge amount of wasted energy. And so what Leslie is looking at doing is, how do you create laws that are going to actually force manufacturers, force the plastic makers to actually cut down the amount of plastic that they're using, stop using it in their packaging, stop using it in the bottles and all the things that we purchase. And how do we do it in a sensible way so that we don't, as she said, go from the frying pan to the fire, where we sort of say, okay, well, we cut out plastic, but then we use all this cornstarch in order to, and we drive the price of corn up, and the people in Mexico can't eat corn and so on. So we're looking at a very, very complex issue here, people. As if you're just joining us, we're talking about the big plastic patches out in the ocean, most notably the Pacific Gyre, it's called. And now the plastic is so big, it's the size of Texas. Some people say it's the size of Canada. There's actually lawsuits between the companies and the manufacturers of alternative plastics as to actually how big it is, because the plastic companies say, you're being sensationalistic. It's actually just the size of Texas. It's not the size of Canada. So this is the terms of the debate. And so then, of course, the small plastic manufacturer, the alternative plastic manufacturer, is on the back foot trying to defend a legal case, saying it actually is as big as Canada. So depending on how big it is irrelevant. We know that it's out there. We know that the plastic is breaking down. We know that it's harming marine life. We know it's ending up in the human food chain, and we know that it's having an impact on human life. As Captain Moore said, it's actually being consumed up in the Eskimo and the Inuit people up in Alaska are eating so much fish that they're actually having endocrine disruption, where they're starting to see a 4-to-1 birth rate, 4 girls for every boy that's being born, just because of all the plastic that's in the fish in the sea. So really a fascinating and troubling subject here today, because it's not just the Pacific patch. There's a big Pacific patch in the North Pacific up by Hawaii, but there's now one in the South Pacific, there's one in the Indian Ocean, there's one in the North Atlantic, and one in the South Atlantic. So this is only getting worse, people, and until we start to see some courageous legislation going forward, where we actually put the brakes on the manufacturers, we're going to see more and more that's washing up on our beaches, choking our marine life, ending up on our plate in the form of different fish, and then we're going to start to see cancer rates increasing and all kinds of bad things. So this is as close to a global crisis as you can get here, and I would question what the environment minister even has to say on this issue, because I haven't seen a coherent strategy in trying to reduce plastic bags. Bangladesh, people, has cut out plastic bags. New Zealand still allows plastic bags to be used. Even here in an enlightened community like Golden Bay in Takaka, I can go down and buy a $2 item and they offer me a plastic bag. We've got to step up our game here and really start to set an example. And we're a small enough country that we can implement some serious laws that are going to really send a message to the manufacturers. Now, our last guest today is we're very pleased to have him. His name is Fabien Cousteau. He is the grandson of Jacques Cousteau, the legendary oceanographer and ocean explorer. And he has spent his whole life, basically, he's in his 30s, he spent his whole life since he was 4 scuba diving, going to different remote parts of the world and experiencing the wonder and the mystery and the joy and the beauty of the ocean. And he has been more upset than anyone by the amount of plastic that he sees. He gets into an island out in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the Pacific, thousands of miles from any human habitation, and there's bottles floating by, and there's junk floating on the beaches, and there's huge mounds of it on these remote beaches. So I had the luxury of speaking with him. He's in New York City, and this is a conversation that I had with him by telephone, talking about what impact this plastic actually has on the marine life.
The plastics that are in our oceans have a very fundamental impact on marine life on a number of different levels. I hesitate to answer the question solely based on the North Pacific Gyre, because the problem is that we're singling out that particular location as far as plastic pollution, when in reality there are gyres in every ocean full of plastics. So there's one in the South Pacific, there's one in the Indian Ocean, North and South Atlantic, even some in the Mediterranean, et cetera, et cetera. So we really need to see this as a global problem, and if statistics are correct, human beings are dumping over 1 million pounds of plastics in our oceans every single hour of every single day worldwide. So this is an enormous problem, as you can imagine, because plastics do not break down easily. As a matter of fact, any plastic that has been created since the dawn of plastic over 100 years ago is still in existence today. So you can see the enormity of the problem. Now, with regard to marine life is entangled in plastic, ingests plastic, is obstructed by plastic, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In many cases, it creates deaths, over 1 million worldwide every year in various forms in terms of animals, whether it's the large animals such as the whales or the smaller critters such as the phytoplankton, which eat some of the little bits and pieces of plastic that has broken up, not broken down, but broken up, so that it enters into the food web. And, all the toxins and that the plastics are made of are being absorbed in many cases into these animals, which then carry them around for the rest of their lives, and eventually it makes its way up that food chain or that food web, and eventually it makes its way all the way to our plate, and we end up eating some of our own garbage. So it's an enormous problem. We've just begun to scratch the surface as far as reflections on the enormity of the problem, because a lot of it is still unknown. A lot of it is still floating out there. In some cases, the heavier plastics actually go to the bottom, and God knows what happens with those.
So the corporations that are pumping out this plastic in terms of their packaging and we consumers that are using it, it's very unlikely that people are going to sit up and take notice if there's some whales and some plankton and some fish. At what point do you think that this will start to have an impact on human health?
Well, I think it already is having an impact on human health. Most of the time we just don't notice it because there's something called the body burden or tissue onloading of these toxic chemicals. Human beings create over 100,000 man-made chemicals, and of which we only test for about 10,000 or so. If one is to take what is called a body burden test, you can test for those chemicals in your own body when you go to the doctor, visit the doctors next time. And the results are shocking. There's not a single human being born on the planet today that isn't born with at least 250 different chemicals in their system. So the enormity of the problem is already at our doorstep, and we just don't know it. And at the same time, we're starting to see correlation between the failing health of some of these animals in the oceans due to a lot of ingestion of these different chemicals, not all from plastics, but plastics certainly have a very large role to play in it. And the failing health of, or the increasing problems in health as far as human beings are concerned with regard to things like cancer rates, learning and behavioral disabilities, physical disabilities, and so on and so forth. These lines are starting to be drawn between the fact that we use our planet and our oceans more specifically as not only, of course, an endless resource, but as a garbage dump. And unfortunately, plastics, as part of that big, humongous garbage dump, are those things that we dump with great abandon because they're so convenient, because they're so disposable. These things that are made for our convenience to use for 30 seconds are made with a material that's made to last over 500 years. And that's therein lies the big problem. So we need to recalibrate our thought process in terms of using materials for the right purpose. I'm not 100% against plastics. As a matter of fact, plastics can be very useful if used properly. I would rather shy away from petroleum-based plastics in general, but it's impossible to get away from plastics in our modern-day lives 100%. That said, the first step to going to those extents over the next few decades or the next century would be to get rid of those single-use plastics, which are really the bane and the main crux of this this issue that we have with plastic pollution in our oceans.
And obviously, we're starting to see movement in the idea of trying to legislate this problem, or at least, corporations are making the right noises and trying to say, okay, we're going to reduce some of our single-use plastic. To what extent that's greenwashing it varies, obviously. But nobody seems to have any real plan for how we're going to clean up, if we're going to clean up the stuff that's already in the oceans. And what sort of response do you find? You've been talking about this for the last few years. Are you finding that people are as concerned about what's in the ocean, and are we getting any sort of movement in terms of any solutions for cleaning this up?
Well, and that's something that comes up time and time again, cleaning up our own mess, and I'm all for that. But the issue is we've woken up a little too late. And now we find ourselves faced with an enormous mess that spans the ocean around the world. In some cases, it's very dramatic, and you can see pollution, mostly plastic pollution, 90 feet thick. And in some places, it's almost transparent, and you can barely see anything unless you take large scoop samples in which you see like a plastic soup within it. The short is that I unfortunately don't see a pragmatic solution that's been proposed yet to clean up the oceans as they are today. My main gripe with that is that by cleaning up the oceans, we're not addressing the fundamental problem, which is the pollution in the first place, which is the creation of these single-use plastics, and more importantly, the use with great abandon of these single-use plastics, and then the improper disposal of these plastics. So all those are much, are at least as important as actually cleaning up the ocean. But on a purely economic level, I haven't seen anyone come up with a viable solution to address something such as the North Pacific Gyre, which is the crux of everyone's debate, which is the largest one, which spans the size of Canada, from about 150 miles off of California to about 120 or so miles off of Japan. That's an enormous body of water to try and clean up. And there's no fleet in the world, even less a group of fleets in the world that could go out there and clean all of that up. And that in lies the problem. It's the debris fields around the world are so enormous and so spread out that I would like to believe that we can do it. But on a pragmatic level, it would require enormous commitment from pretty much every country around the world to go and clean that up.
Now, your family, your grandfather and your father have been, real champions, as well as yourself and your sister, of conservation and raising awareness and stuff like that. And your grandfather saw a lot of the writing on the wall for the way that our consumer society was going to impact on the marine habitat. Was he? Did he have any direct experience of these plastic patches? And what do you think he would say about where we're at now?
Well, unfortunately, I have too much experience with these plastic garbage patches. I think we all do. That anyone who's been out on the oceans at some point or another has seen plastic garbage out there. Or even if you've strolled down the beach and you're not necessarily a sailor or a diver, I'm sure you've seen plastic on the beach. We did a voyage to Kure. Kure is the last atoll on the Hawaiian island chain, which is 1,200 miles from any civilization, and yet you can find 8 feet thick worth of debris on the beach, debris being mostly plastic pollution. And, it's those things that we run into all the time when we go off on expeditions. We go hundreds, if not thousands of miles where human beings are and still find this plastic in various places. Anything from ghost nets that get cut off of the fishing trawlers through the single-use plastics such as straws and lighters and water bottles and plastic bags and so on and so forth, and of course packaging. that ends up floating in the oceans for 500 plus years. It's atrocious, and it's just another sign of the fundamental and enormous impact that human beings have on a body of water that in the past we thought was endless and indestructible. It's shocking. My grandfather was talking about plastic pollution 30 plus years ago, as I'm sure you know, and now we're 3 generations later still talking about the same issue, except the issue has not gotten even to be more of a problem. There is a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel. I think finally the plastic pollution issue is getting some traction worldwide. In some countries, things like plastic bags have been banned or have been heavily taxed, or you have to pay for them. Water bottles are another issue, especially plastic water bottles for frivolous things such as designer water, which in many developed countries is not necessary. Now the designers of those plastic water bottles are starting to use alternative materials, but we're far from a perfect solution. Being disposable is not necessarily as innovative and as convenient as one thinks.
That was Fabien Cousteau joining us on the telephone from New York City. He is the grandson of Jacques Cousteau, the very famous ocean explorer, and one of the people who really brought to the attention of the world not just this problem, but all the beautiful balance of marine life and how human beings can interact with it and how they currently interact with it. And so that was Fabien sharing some of his direct experiences of frustration in seeing so much plastic out there, and really the general consensus is that there is no way we're going to clean this up anytime soon. The best hope that we have of not poisoning the world of our children and our grandchildren is to stop using the plastic. Now that's stop using it, stop using the bags, stop using the bottles, stop using the plastic products. And that is not going to happen just through a general goodwill of people. That actually has to happen from the governments working together, and that it can even happen on a local small government level. So this has been a presentation of Before the Flood. I'm your host, Patrick Rose. You've been listening to Fresh FM, broadcasting across the top of the South Island and around the world at freshfm.net. Green Magic Nurseries is the sponsor of Before the Flood, and I'll leave you now with Debussy's La Mer, just to send you on your way for the weekend.
Thanks to New Zealand On Air for making this program available through funding the Access Internet Radio project.